the British government conducted a confidential emergency simulation known as Exercise Turnstone. The scenario modeled by senior officials was not a response to nuclear detonation or a coordinated attack on the capital. The crisis being war-gamed in a secure room involving representatives from the Ministry of Defense, the Cabinet Office, and the Department for Business was a supermarket aisle devoid of goods. Senior officials examined the precise consequences for the national food supply should the Strait of Hormuz remain impassable throughout the summer months. A prominent newspaper of record with a reputation for sober editorial standards first broke the story, and it was independently verified by the national broadcaster within a matter of hours. The conclusions drawn from that exercise were sufficiently alarming that the government made a concerted effort to keep the findings under wraps. At the center of this classified concern lies a hidden vulnerability, a singular industrial dependency that connects a waterway in the Middle East directly to the refrigerated shelves of British grocers. This is not primarily a narrative concerning petroleum costs or maritime logistics. This is a narrative concerning carbon dioxide. Once the precise function of this gas within the national food infrastructure is understood, the hum of a supermarket chiller takes on an entirely different and more precarious significance. Most members of the public associate carbon dioxide with effervescent beverages and sparkling water. While that perception is accurate, it is vastly incomplete. Carbon dioxide functions as one of the most critical industrial gases underpinning the entire contemporary food logistics network. Within the specific context of Britain, it fulfills three essential roles that rarely, if ever, register in the mind of the average consumer. In the first instance, the gas is injected directly into the modified atmosphere packaging that extends the viable shelf life of fresh produce, including bagged salads, portioned meats, bakery items, and pre-cut vegetables. If the supply of carbon dioxide were to be removed from that equation, the shelf life of those products would collapse from a matter of days to a matter of hours, rendering the central distribution model of modern retail functionally unworkable. In the second instance, carbon dioxide is utilized extensively in the commercial refrigeration systems that maintain the cold chain within supermarket display cases and regional distribution hubs. While not every system in the country relies on this gas, a significant and growing proportion of the infrastructure that British food retailers depend upon is built around carbon dioxide-based cooling technologies. In the third instance, and this is the detail that generated the most immediate and visceral reaction when it surfaced, carbon dioxide is used in the stunning process during the slaughter of pigs and poultry. Under current regulations governing animal welfare in British abattoirs, animals are rendered unconscious through controlled exposure to carbon dioxide prior to slaughter. This method is described in welfare standards as a humane means of pre-slaughter stunning, and it is a legal requirement for pigs. It is also the predominant methodology employed across the nation's major poultry processing facilities. In the absence of a reliable carbon dioxide stream, the slaughter process would either grind to a complete halt or require a rapid and legally complex reversion to alternative stunning methods that are far less efficient for large-scale operations. Consequently, when reports emerge detailing the risk of food shortages tied directly to carbon dioxide scarcity, they were not describing a minor inconvenience. They were outlining a cascading failure that initiates at the abattoir door, travels through the cold storage network, and terminates at the empty shelf of the retailer in that precise and unforgiving sequence. The question that was not asked with sufficient volume or urgency in the domestic press during the initial wave of coverage was this: where does Britain actually source its industrial carbon dioxide? The answer is more disquieting than the query itself might imply. Britain imports a substantial fraction of its industrial carbon dioxide requirement from the European Union. In turn, the European Union sources a significant portion of its own supply from production chains linked directly to the Gulf region. The carbon dioxide used for food processing and refrigeration is predominantly a byproduct of fertilizer manufacturing and petrochemical refining. It is captured, purified, and then sold into the industrial gas market. When energy exports from the Gulf region experience disruption, as has been the case since the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz following military action by the United States and Israel against Iran in late February, the production of ammonia-based fertilizers slows dramatically. As that upstream production contracts, the downstream byproduct stream of carbon dioxide that feeds the European food industry contracts along with it. This pre-existing vulnerability was further compounded by the administrative and logistical friction introduced by the nation's departure from the European Union. By exiting the bloc, Britain forfeited its seamless integration into the internal supply networks and mutual assistance frameworks that govern crisis response among member states. During a standard disruption scenario, a member state can draw upon coordinated reserves and priority access arrangements shared among its neighbors. Britain is now required to negotiate each transaction separately, operating at prevailing market rates in direct competition with European Union buyers, who benefit from preferential treatment within the common market framework. When the story broke, the cabinet minister responsible for business appeared on a major news network and stated, in a direct quote, that at this present moment the public should continue with their normal routines. This statement is, in the strictest technical sense, accurate. At the time of writing in the middle of April, there are no widespread gaps on supermarket shelves. The crisis that Exercise Turnstone modeled is a projected scenario, a forecast of potential future strain rather than a snapshot of present reality. However, the government's own internal modeling indicated that the situation would become critical should the Strait of Hormuz remain closed throughout the approach to summer. And as of the most recent developments, the strait had reopened for precisely 18 hours on a Friday before being closed again on Saturday morning due to the ongoing naval blockade and associated geopolitical friction. The timeline against which the British government is now operating is not an abstract planning horizon. It is measured in weeks. In response to the findings of the simulation, the government did not merely file the report and move on. A contingency plan was activated. A major bioethanol production facility located in the northeast of England, which produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct of fermenting wheat into fuel-grade ethanol, was instructed to resume full production. The business secretary confirmed in a televised interview that the plant is currently operating at maximum output and is capable of supplying in excess of 50% of the nation's total carbon dioxide requirements under a worst-case scenario. The figure of 50% was presented to the public as a source of reassurance, evidence that the government had a grip on the situation. In reality, that number is perhaps the single most concerning headline embedded in the entire narrative. If the primary import supply chain is completely severed, the domestic backup facility covers only half of national demand. The remaining 50% of demand would either be subject to strict rationing, procured through emergency international tenders at vastly inflated cost, or simply left unfulfilled. Representatives from the major supermarket chains were summoned to government briefings to discuss contingency planning. According to reporting from the national broadcaster, as of the week the story entered the public domain, not a single major retailer had logged a supply disruption with the government's central monitoring system. That is genuinely welcome news for the immediate term. The anxiety is not centered on the state of play today. The anxiety is rooted in the understanding that the lead time between an upstream carbon dioxide shortage signal and the appearance of visible shelf gaps at a major retail outlet is exceptionally short, measured in days rather than weeks. Once that gap manifests, the window for corrective action is minuscule. Retail trade bodies have characterized the current situation as stable but precarious, a description that does little to generate public alarm until the moment it suddenly and irrevocably does. Yet food security, as concerning as that dossier had become, represented only the first of several files to land on the government's desk in a single week that brought the nation's exposure to this foreign conflict into sharp and uncomfortable focus. This was the week when the American president decided to go after the one economic pillar that had, until that point, insulated the British economy from the worst of the spillover effects of the crisis. The bilateral trade agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom, which had been finalized earlier in the year, represented a cornerstone achievement for the British Prime Minister. To fully grasp its significance, one must first understand the underlying economic position of Britain in the years following its withdrawal from the European Union. When the country formally exited the bloc, it surrendered access to the single market, the integrated trading framework that had governed the overwhelming majority of British commerce for several decades. For a period of several years, the nation operated without a comprehensive trade agreement with either the European Union or the United States, relying instead on the default terms established by the World Trade Organization. When the current administration in Washington assumed office and imposed a broad suite of global tariffs, It delivered a clear message to all nations seeking relief: come and negotiate bilaterally. The British Prime Minister traveled to the White House and secured an agreement. That deal reduced the tariff exposure on British steel, aluminum, automotive exports, and pharmaceutical products destined for the American market. For key sectors of British manufacturing, particularly the automotive industry and the steel communities of South Wales and Yorkshire, that agreement represented the margin between viable export economics and a slow, grinding structural decline. The American president, however, subsequently gave an interview in which he characterized the deal as one that was better than he had to give, before adding a caveat that it could always be changed. The context for that remark was unambiguous. When asked to describe the current state of the transatlantic special relationship, the president's response was blunt. He stated that the relationship was one where, when they were asked for assistance, they were not there. When they were needed, they were not there. When they were not needed, they were still not there. The British government has, to this point, resisted every form of entreaty to join the military campaign in the Middle East, whether in terms of troop contributions, intelligence sharing, or logistical support. The Prime Minister has held that position both in public statements and private diplomatic channels, maintaining a posture of non-participation against sustained pressure from Washington for the entire length of the conflict. The Prime Minister's public response to the suggestion that the trade deal might be altered was equally direct. He stated that his position on the conflict had been clear from the outset, that the nation would not be dragged into a war that was not its own. He acknowledged that considerable pressure had been applied to alter that course, but he was not going to change his mind nor yield to that pressure. The leader of a major opposition party went a step further during parliamentary proceedings, describing the American president in terms more commonly associated with organized crime syndicates than diplomatic discourse. This opposition leader called upon the Prime Minister to advise the monarch to cancel an upcoming state visit to the United States entirely, arguing that no member of the royal family should be seen shaking the hand of an individual who conducts international relations in such a manner. The state visit had already been scheduled as the first of its kind in a decade, and the political calculus surrounding whether it should proceed has become a matter of intense and active debate within the corridors of power. However, the threat of a trade deal being unwound, as economically damaging as that would be, was not the most corrosive story to break over Britain that week. A parallel political crisis, one that had been festering beneath the surface for months, was finally bursting into the open at the worst possible moment. Before examining that scandal in detail, there remains one further economic file that must be placed upon the table. The European continent is facing a jet fuel shortage. This is not a speculative projection or a worst-case theoretical exercise. It is a confirmed and quantified operational reality. According to reports from multiple aviation sources that have been corroborated by international financial media, European airports currently possess approximately 6 weeks of jet fuel reserves based on current consumption rates. By the middle to the end of May, airlines operating out of major European Union hubs will face active constraints on fuel allocation. A major national flag carrier on the continent, known for its operational reliability, announced the cancellation of 60 flights scheduled for the coming month. A prominent low-cost carrier, the largest of its kind operating in the European market, issued a profit warning for the first half of the year, explicitly citing elevated fuel costs and diminished capacity on high-demand summer leisure routes. The practical implication for European travelers is straightforward. As the month of April draws to a close, airlines will begin eliminating routes that cannot be flown profitably under the current fuel cost regime. These cuts will commence with less trafficked leisure destinations and frequencies scheduled during off-peak hours. As the month of May progresses and reserves are drawn down further, the reductions will become structural in nature. Popular trunk routes, not merely marginal connections, will begin to disappear from reservation systems. The summer travel season, which represents the single most critical period for the European tourism economy, is set to commence in earnest in June. Should no diplomatic resolution be reached between the principal parties to the conflict by that juncture, the summer travel season in Europe will bear a closer resemblance to the unprecedented groundings of the pandemic era than to any normal period of commercial aviation. Airlines, food distribution networks, carbon dioxide supply chains, and international trade agreements Every single one of these threads traces back to the same geographical and geopolitical choke point. And while the British government is attempting to manage all of these external shocks, it has simultaneously been grappling with an internal political scandal that strikes at the very heart of the Prime Minister's authority and judgment. This is a scandal that has been building quietly since the first days of the administration. The individual at the center of it is one of the most formidable political strategists in the history of the governing party. He is credited with helping to rebuild the party's electoral machine in the previous decade, having served in multiple cabinet positions and survived 2 forced resignations from government, a feat almost unheard of in modern British political life. When the current Prime Minister ran for the leadership of his party and subsequently won a landslide general election victory, this strategist was widely described as a political godfather figure, the unseen architect who helped shape the strategy that delivered a parliamentary majority. The Prime Minister sought to repay that political debt by appointing this figure as the nation's ambassador to the United States. The appointment was confirmed in late 2024, coinciding with the return of the current administration to the White House. On the surface, the appointment seemed logical. The nominee possessed deep connections in Washington and decades of transatlantic diplomatic experience. There was, however, a significant and potentially disqualifying problem. Multiple individuals within the Prime Minister's own office raised concerns privately before the appointment was finalized. The nominee had a documented and widely reported association with a convicted financier who was connected to an international network of abuse involving prominent figures in politics, business, and royalty. While the existence of the relationship had been a matter of public record for some time, the full depth and recency of the association had not been fully understood. Then a fresh tranche of legal documents related to the financier's network was unsealed. The files revealed that the nominee's exposure to the network was significantly deeper and more recent than previously acknowledged. References to the co-founder of the nominee's own lobbying firm appeared in the financier's records from 2010, a date that fell 2 full years after the financier's initial criminal conviction for offenses involving minors. The question facing the government was no longer merely one of political judgment. It was a question of whether a sitting British ambassador to the most important Allied capital was compromised, and whether that vulnerability had been actively flagged and subsequently ignored during the vetting process prior to the appointment being made public. When the files exploded into the public domain, the Prime Minister was asked directly during a session of the House of Commons whether the security vetting process for the ambassadorial appointment had raised any concerns. He assured the chamber that all appropriate high-level security fitness checks had been completed and cleared. That statement subsequently proved to be inaccurate. The question then became, was it wrong, and who was responsible for the discrepancy? The senior civil servant officially responsible for overseeing high-level security vetting at the Foreign Ministry was an individual who had reportedly told the Prime Minister during the vetting process that they harbored personal reservations about the nominee's fitness for the role, but they had simultaneously represented to the Prime Minister that the formal security checks had been finalized in a satisfactory manner. In practical terms, the security assessment process for the appointment had not been conducted with the degree of rigor that a diplomatic posting of that sensitivity and visibility demands. When parliamentary investigators began to examine the paper trail, the documentation was found to be incomplete and, in certain critical areas, deficient. The Prime Minister, who had stood before the legislature and attested that everything was properly cleared, was now caught in a vice. He had either inadvertently misled Parliament, or had been deliberately misled himself by the official responsible for running the vetting process. The Metropolitan Police Service launched a criminal investigation into the former ambassador on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The specific allegation centered on claims that the individual had, years earlier during a previous tenure as a government minister, leaked sensitive communications from within government to the convicted financier. The former ambassador was arrested in February of this year and was subsequently released on police bail pending further investigation. He had already resigned his diplomatic post, surrendered his membership in the governing political party, and vacated his seat in the upper legislative chamber. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, the operative credited with running the successful election campaign, tendered their resignation over the appointment, In a public statement, the former chief of staff said the decision to proceed with the appointment had been an error, one that had inflicted damage upon the party, the nation, and the public's trust in the political process. The Prime Minister eventually dismissed the senior civil servant responsible for the flawed vetting review from their post. The Prime Minister accepted responsibility for the gap that existed between the statement made to the House of Commons and the reality of what the vetting process had actually yielded. He confirmed that he would return to the legislature to provide a more complete and accurate account of events. He remains in office, but the damage inflicted upon his political authority, arriving on top of the economic pressures generated by the foreign war, the explicit threats to the transatlantic trade deal, the simmering crisis in food supply logistics, and the continental jet fuel shortage, has compressed his political operating room to virtually nothing. If one steps back from the minutiae of these individual crises and examines the wider tableau, a stark picture emerges. Britain did not initiate this war. It did not vote for this conflict in any international forum. It was not consulted about the decision to escalate hostilities, and it has refused to participate in the military campaign at every juncture where pressure has been exerted. And yet, it remains one of the most economically exposed nations on the face of the planet to the cascading consequences of that same conflict. In certain critical supply chain respects, it is arguably more exposed than some of the nations that are actively engaged in combat operations. Its supermarket operators are running contingency simulations that model empty shelves. Its airlines are canceling flights because they cannot secure affordable access to fuel. Its single largest external trading relationship is being openly threatened by the same head of state who is prosecuting the war that Britain refused to join. Its government is simultaneously managing a political scandal involving a compromised envoy, a misleading statement to the legislature, and an active police investigation into a former senior party figure with ties to one of the most notorious and toxic names in recent international history. The opposition leader who used such undiplomatic language in the chamber to describe the American president was not merely engaging in hyperbole or rhetorical theater. That language was an expression, in unusually raw and direct terms, of a deep and growing frustration felt across the political spectrum. It is the frustration of a country that perceives itself as being economically coerced by the fallout of a conflict it explicitly and repeatedly opposed. There is a version of how this sequence of events resolves that remains manageable. In that version, a diplomatic agreement is reached between the primary belligerents before the onset of the summer demand surge. The strait reopens fully and without further interruption. Carbon dioxide supply chains stabilize and return to normal pricing and volume levels. Airlines restore the capacity that has been removed from their summer schedules. The trade deal survives the current political turbulence intact. The Prime Minister completes the remainder of the parliamentary term with his government's mandate still standing. There is, of course, another version. Exercise Turnstone was specifically designed and conducted to model precisely how that alternative version unfolds. The nation has been a passenger on a turbulent and unexpected journey since the first strikes landed in late February. The difference, however, is that this particular passenger paid for a premium seat, declined the invitation to assist in the cockpit, and is now being informed that the in-flight service is being suspended and the final destination has been altered without prior consultation. The supply of fresh provisions is already becoming more difficult to keep at a safe temperature, and the aircraft has not yet begun its final descent. The situation remains fluid, and the next checkpoint on the calendar is now only days away, at which point every one of these overlapping files will shift forward once more.